Welcome to the Nevada Independent's On the Record interview with Congressman Mark Amodei, who is facing a primary challenge from Douglas County Commissioner Danny Tarkanian, but hopes to win another term in Ruby Red District 2. Congressman, thanks for agreeing to this interview. Everyone, I'm Elizabeth Thompson, and I'm joined today by reporter Janelle Calderon and assistant editor Jackie Valley. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Congressman, so let's start here. Why do you deserve re-election?
Well, I think it's one of those things where these are tough times, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, anything else like that. Having some experience in how Washington works, but more so having a lot of experience in how Nevada's original congressional district works, you've learned the ropes. You've learned how to do oversight of those agencies, which are very important in Nevada. You've learned how to do constituent services for people, whether it's Social Security, IRS, whatever. And you've also learned how to do the voting stuff, which quite frankly is not the majority of your work, but it is the majority of what gets reported on. So when you sit there and look at that and you say, well, is it a good time to change hands? And am I still excited about the work? Do I still think the work is important? Yeah. The culture in Washington may not be that impressive, but it's one of those things where I think it's time for a steady hand on the tiller, if you will. And I've been fortunate enough to be elected 6 times, counting the initial special election. And so it's like, hey, you know, we think we've got a good system in place. We think we're doing good work. We think when the chips are down, we can produce good results. And so we're going to see if the voters agree with us.
So because you've been in there 6 terms, I'm curious to ask you, there are all these litmus tests for, who's the most serious conservative and, who's too moderate. Do you think you've changed much over the 6 terms? Are there any issues that you've shifted on?
Well, I think my voting record on some of those core issues, the border, right to life, Second Amendment, fiscal conservatism, all that, listen, it's been pretty constant throughout. Now, the one thing that people forget about is most of the time I've been back there, Barack Obama was the president for the first 5 years. Joe Biden's been the president for the last 14 months. In the middle of that was 4 years of Donald Trump. That doesn't mean we've been like a windsock and changed. But at the same time, Nevada needs results on some things. I mean, Harry Reid was in the Senate. I worked with Harry Reid on lands bills, and I'm not going to It's like, listen, I did what I thought was right for the issue for the people in Nevada. Always have, and would continue to do so if I was allowed to serve another 24 months.
So because voter integrity and elections is a hot topic still, and numerous Republican candidates across the country and in this state are still talking about rampant voter fraud, still claiming that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president, still claiming that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. Just tell us once and for all where you stand on all that.
Well, it's pretty simple. In the 15 rural counties in Nevada, Donald Trump won by 75,000 votes. In my district, I won by 60,000. In my district, Donald Trump won by 40,000. So it's a little tough for a guy from that district to stand up and call out all those county clerks and that one county election official in Washoe and say, hey, by the way, this was all garbage. And so when all else fails, it's like common sense. And so do I fully support having to show ID to vote? Yeah, I do. Do I agree with AB 321 that the Nevada legislature did 90 days before the last presidential election? No, I don't. So I fully support what they're doing now with the initiative petition to try to say, hey, enough of AB 321. Let's have to show some ID to vote. But as far as how it went in my part of the state, it's like I don't think any of the stuff that was thrown around for other states really applies when your guy, not your guy, but my guy, basically won by 75,000 votes in rural Nevada.
So as far as you're concerned, Joe Biden is our duly elected president.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're 14 months down the road. I'm not an expert on Pennsylvania or Arizona or the other ones. And I suppose the lawyers will grind through it, but even the Supreme Court has weighed in on some of that stuff. And if it changes, great. I think though, looking down the road for a solution, voter ID is the solution.
What about mail voting? I wasn't planning on asking you that, but I'm curious. Where do you stand on that?
You know what? There's nothing wrong with mail voting. As long as you have to show some ID and do something to get a ballot, instead of just being on a list and getting a ballot, which is AB 321, I don't like that. I mean, we had mail-in voting before. It was called absentee ballot. So the concept of it, as long as there's some safeguards, so that it isn't just, hey, we're going out to the mail for everybody that happens to get one, and then you have no security over that, that's not good. So if you call it the same as absentee voting, You put some safeguards in there for ID, you got to request it, there's some way to verify it. Great. And by the way, we did that on absentee balloting. And so it's not like, oh my God, it's going to disenfranchise them. It's like, we know how to do that. We should do it.
Well, we'd like to turn to the economy now.
Okay.
Obviously, lots of government spending over the past few years with the federal COVID relief bills. But some economists are saying that those may have led to inflation. Do you think the trade-off was worth it?
Well, we'll never know because, quite frankly, when in March of, 2020, Houston, we've got a problem, is the nice way of saying it. If we'd have done nothing, we'll never know what we did because we didn't do nothing. We did the first bill that was meant to keep people at work. We had to catch up in terms of personal protective gear, testing, start the whole vaccine stuff. And so if you say, do you have it to do over again? It's like, quite frankly, there was nobody at the time going, watch it. Now, I'm the first one to admit it's like it was all on the credit card. But after that, when you talk about subsequent votes like to raise the debt limit, to do more supposed COVID spending, which was more about, I think, agenda than the party who won the presidential election. So it's like, listen, I'm not going to say, gee, I wish we hadn't done that COVID stuff. It was phenomenally important to provide those payroll protection loans that kept people working and businesses open while everything was shut down. And so, yeah, I think that was the right thing to do. But subsequently, you know that old saying, I think it was Rahm Emanuel or somebody else says, you never want to waste a good crisis because you can get things done that you couldn't get done before. And it's like, yeah, but if that's agenda-driven spending, then obviously that's a problem, which is why I think when you talk about the subsequent bills that went in, and even to the extent of the infrastructure bill, and then the Build Back Better, my reading of them is this is a bunch of agenda stuff, and quite frankly, it's trillions more dollars, and we maxed out, if you will, the credit card limit in terms of the initial reaction to COVID. And then there were some other good things that said, why don't you see how that's working before you throw more money in or whatever, because you couldn't spend that much money fast enough. So I think it was a responsible thing to say, let's see how it's working, and then see if we need to apply more here or there. And there were some of those spots. The problem is the subsequent spending was a lot more about Green New Deal or trying to federalize elections or stuff that was, I refer to those things as agenda things. And it's like, no, I'm not voting for that.
So now that inflation has heated up, what should be done about that?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is, with all due respect, is you need to take us back to energy independence. And the one thing that nobody's talking about in that is nobody is taking into account the progress that we've made in what comes out the tailpipe or the smokestack of vehicles, or even coal-fired power plants, where it's like that may not be the future forever, but for right now, this country has made tremendous strides in terms of cleaning up our air and starting to pivot towards renewables and low carbon stuff, but to basically take the position that this administration has taken, which is we need to do it ASAP, we need to shut that stuff down right now, and you look at it, and here we are in a position of vulnerability within the country in inflation as well as without the country in terms of other geopolitical activities.
So let me make sure I understand you. You're saying that temporarily we should lean more on fossil fuels while we're dealing with the inflationary crisis?
What I am saying is not temporarily, but we need to take into account the progress that we've made in terms of clean air, clean water, all that stuff environmentally, and not act like no progress has been made and therefore you need to shut that down and go to war with those energy companies. It's like, I don't think it justifies that. And by the way, if it's really one planet, then when you compare that with what other people are doing, not that that should be what we do, we should continue to lead, but you look at that and you go, China's building 500 coal-fired power plants in the next 10 years. And so how do you take that into account? Doesn't mean we should let off the gas, no pun intended, on what we're doing. But having said that, it's like when this started out as an inflation question. It's like when gas has gone up $1.50 or $2, and everybody needs it no matter what you're doing. Or it's like that's one of the major problems right there.
Well, and that leads perfectly into our next question, which was about gas prices and whether you would do anything differently than what's already been done to ease some of that pain at the pump.
I will try to be crisp for once and say, energy independence in a responsible way is its own medicine in terms of a lot of things that are going wrong in this country. And by doing Keystone Pipeline and other sources of energy, as long as we continue to be responsible about that, pursue the other electric stuff, but it's like that's the biggest thing that we can do right now, lickety split. And oh, by the way, it's not right now. It'll take a year or two to get all that stuff going again too. But it's entirely within our control, and I think represents a piece that's a responsible piece of the pie for strategic independence, cutting down on inflation in the country, and all of those sorts of things.
You also mentioned something earlier about spending and seeing whether it works.
Right.
And I think we may have the opportunity to do that with the education piece of the COVID funding.
So as we know, the federal government funneled an unprecedented amount of money to K through 12 education as part of the COVID relief funds. Mm-hmm. Some are worried that the one-time infusion will hurt schools once it runs dry. Would you support any sort of ongoing federal funding for K through 12 education in schools?
Well, I think you've hit on the important part. You say, well, let's see how it's working. And quite frankly, the how it's working of a lot of the COVID stuff was like, okay, you want better HVAC systems because of air in the classrooms and what that basic safety is in terms of the transmission of a virus and those sorts of things. I don't think we've seen a lot back on that yet where it's like, okay, so let's just narrow it down to Nevada. How many K through 12 classrooms were identified as needing help in HVAC for that in terms of keeping the air squared away? I haven't seen, it's like, well, it's there, it's gone, we're presumed it's good, and we're off to the next one. It's like, wait a minute, let's see what we actually got for that, how it happened, whether it's been used for that, so that when we talk about what do they need going forward in K-12, whether it's, internet connectivity, maybe not a problem in Clark County, but might be a problem in some of the other districts, those sorts of things. The number of students in a classroom depends on all of that, where the HVAC may solve that problem like it did in airplanes, supposedly. I mean, there haven't been any stories about, oh my God, a plane landed in Fort Lauderdale and 70% of the people tested positive for COVID within a couple days. So the technology exists for that, but I think it's a responsible thing to do since we're talking about money and deficits and those sorts of things, and obviously that's a big part of K-12, whether it's state or federal money. It's like, well, let's see what we got for our money first, and then see where we can throw some darts instead of just, no matter what you do, we got to come up with more. Because as we know, the federal government is not a balanced budget operation, and that's why I think you need to be careful about what you do if you go farther in the red.
So you're supporting possible federal funding going forward depending on where it's sent. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm supporting, let's see what we got for the money that was spent and how that's changed K-12 classrooms or K-12 operational costs. You have infrastructure, you have operations, you have whatever. And so knowing that, where that's going, because if a whole bunch of COVID money, quite frankly, went for better healthcare deal for the employees of that school district, it's like, I'd want to know that. To say, well, we thought we were getting safer classrooms, but if it went to something else, I think that's a legitimate part of oversight.
Understood. But if you were satisfied that the money was effective, well spent, did what it was supposed to do, I assume you would support an extension of funding.
Then I would support going, okay, now where's the next biggest area we need funding? In other words, not as a general concept, because I think general concepts tend to get you less and less oversight. And since it is, since there is that concern about how much we're spending and whatever, it's like, well, let me tell you why we're spending that and where it's going and why it's a good idea. Without those components, then just as a general statement, I think that's irresponsible.
I want to know what you think about the Biden administration's approach to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and if you have any criticisms, what are they?
Well, I don't understand the hesitancy, and that's my perception. I don't understand the hesitancy where it's almost like we got to do very, very incremental assistance. I don't think, although recently I think some people said, but nobody's saying I want to send, the 1st Armored Division into Ukraine or the boots on the ground stuff. But Having said that, we have never supported somebody deciding they want to take their neighbor. We didn't let Saddam Hussein do that with the United Arab Emirates. Different time, different administration, all that stuff. It's like I thought, one of the basic rules that we kind of had in the world was, you can fight about a lot of stuff, but you can't just go take your neighbor over. You can't run across the border and do that. And even though there are people who go, well, Ukraine's not exactly wearing white to the wedding, it's like, okay, but nonetheless, that doesn't mean that somebody gets to come take them over. It makes it easier when it's Vladimir Putin doing it. But when you say, what do you think of the administration's response? It's like, they ought to have everything that they need. And by the way,
When you say they, we're talking about Ukraine.
The Ukrainians. And by the way, as we talk about this, they have more than demonstrated their pluck, if you will, in terms of wanting to fight for their own country. So it's not like, hey, we're trying to talk people into, democracy or this, that, or the other sort of thing. They are enthusiastically resisting being overrun by the Soviet Union. And so, having said that, we have the resources, and you've talked about money, we've talked about trillions in terms of COVID relief, and those are huge amounts of money, and then it's like, hey, we got another 800 million for you. And you're going, okay, but kind of like the classroom stuff, it's like, when are you going to get it? And what are you going to get? And how's that going to help? And so, to circle back to where we started, it's like, hey, I think it's been pretty slow and and not charging 800 miles an hour, but nonetheless, they've demonstrated the need. They've proved their worthiness in terms of as fighters for their own soil. I think we should be doing more in terms of equipping them than what we have before.
And what, in your mind, what would be the trigger for sending troops?
I don't know if there is a trigger. And quite frankly, they've demonstrated enough of ability. And by the way, there's two sides to this. The other side is the Russians have sent in about a couple 100,000 folks. And the other side of that is their armies have got about 800,000 right now. And so you're like, well, can we just pull all 800,000 from their other duties around the nation and the world? Not really. So it's like, if you're going to get there, Russia, you got to kind of get there with the 200,000. These folks have proved that they're more than worthy of being able to fight that fight, even though they're not equipped as well as they could be. And so when you say, well, when are we going to send troops in? It's like, I don't know that we need to. I think these folks are doing a good job of covering their own turf. They just need the best possible equipment they can have.
So that's what we're talking about, is supplies and equipment.
Yep.
Okay.
Not troops.
So moving on now, do you support efforts to weaken or eliminate abortion protections offered by Roe v. Wade?
Great question, but here's where you got to start. Since we're sitting in Nevada, the voters in Nevada in the late 80s said, here's what the abortion law in Nevada is going to be. You can have it up to, I think, 180 days. There's some exceptions, life of the mother, other stuff like that. Because they did that through initiative petition, that's how you have to change the law. So if you want to add another exception, or you want to get rid of an exception, or you want to say, you got to have it earlier, you got to have it later, you can't have it at all, it now is exclusively in the province of initiative petition in Nevada. That's great. I'm like, that's fine. I respect the ability of voters to make that decision. So when you ask me, do I support it or not? It's like, well, if it's a Nevada question, quite frankly, it doesn't matter whether I support it or not. And I'm not trying to dodge it. I mean, I've got 100% rating from National Right to Life Foundation, Susan B. Anthony Foundation. So I've been a pro-life person when I've had a vote on something that relates to that. But when you say, what would you do with Roe v. Wade? It's like, guess what? Even the federal government can't come in here because of what Nevada voters have done. And I completely respect that.
Do you think in general, so it's really interesting what's going on around the country to see how different states and different regions are dealing with this, how they're choosing, are they trying to move, it through an initiative position? Are they trying to move it through the legislature? But do you, in general, philosophically, do you think that it's better for the states to determine their own rules on this particular issue than to have the federal government running the show?
As a general proposition, whether you're talking about elections, the law on when a woman has a right to an abortion or not, those sort of things, and I can't think of any exceptions. It's like the closer those decisions are made to home, whether it's your Clark County Commission, whether it's your governor, whether it's your state health department, whether it's initiative petition, I think the better those results are, because quite frankly, what people in Nevada think's important is not necessarily the same as people in South Dakota or in Virginia or wherever else. So yes, those decisions, water rights, you name it, closer to home, it just gives me more confidence, which is why I answered the question the way I did, which is everybody talks about what are you going to do? And it's like, do you understand what the law in Nevada is? Because quite frankly, that doesn't leave a role for a federal legislature to come in and tell Nevadans what the rule ought to be.
Should someone from out of state in one of those states where they are adding more restrictions be allowed to come to Nevada then, if the law allows it so?
Well, I think the way the initiative petition reads right now, it says, hey, if you're in Nevada, there's not a big jurisdiction section. It says if you're in Nevada and you decide you want to avail yourself of this medical procedure and it's within the parameters of what the voters decided, then quite frankly, as a licensed physician in Nevada, if you're following the law, you're following the law. It's kind of like what former Governor Brian Sandoval said about the Affordable Care Act. It's the law until it's not the law. You may not agree with it, but if you respect the system and how that got on the books, then you respect it.
We do have a question about that later too.
Okay.
But right now we want to turn to housing, the
Okay.
big hot topic right now. We've seen what's happening in
Everywhere.
Nevada and other states as well. So, I mean, do you think Congress should be doing anything to help? And if so, what?
Well, once again, it gets you to, well, what are the issues driving that in Nevada versus what they're doing in Pennsylvania or elsewhere and those sorts of things. And so, obviously, I'm looking at it in terms of what's the deal in Nevada. As we sit here in Clark County, which is, by the way, has been the beneficiary of one of the most innovative public lands acts, maybe the most in the whole nation, Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act. Why did they do that? They did that, it's over 20 years old now, by the way, and still hasn't sold all the acreage that was permitted 20 years ago, which means it's not like, hey, here we go, helter-skelter, just subdivide and bulldoze everything and there you go. But it was brought about because of a situation in Clark County, which plays out in every community in Nevada, which is you're totally surrounded by federal land. So if you want to do a strip mall, a resort casino, houses for people to live in that work in those places, whatever you want to do, you have to do a lands bill in order to give your local planning and zoning folks the jurisdiction over how they want to grow. That was the genius of SNPLMA. And so when you say, what do we ought to do? It's like, listen, right now, in order for that to happen, you got to pass a bill in Congress to transfer that land. That process has not proved to be real nimble in the last few years, although I'll say this, and I probably shouldn't, but when Harry Reid was in the Senate, quite frankly, when things got squared away in the Conservation Department the way he wanted them, that bill moved. And so, no offense to Catherine or Jackie, but there are people in the Senate now, most of them in staff positions, that still think that they're staffers, mind you. Well, my concerns weren't really given much credence by the then senior senator from Nevada, and so we're holding stuff up. And so when you sit there and you look at it, it's like, well, we can talk all you want, but unless that inventory of potential developable land in accordance with local planning and zoning decisions is increased, you're going to continue to increase the pressure within the existing jurisdictional footprints of your county commission, your city councils, and all that stuff. And quite frankly, we know before you get to the supply side stuff and interest rates, that if there's no place to build, you're going to redevelop or you're going to increase density, and the costs for that never mean that it goes down. And so, quite frankly, the rest of the state, and by the way, it's time for an update for SNPLMA as well, until we put that on a more predictable level in terms of what are we going to have, what are we going to do for infill, all those planning and zoning things, and you mold that in with what the federal policy is, then you're going to continue to struggle this way. Those costs are going to stay the same. And I don't need to tell you guys, it's like, listen, if this is an attractive place for people to come, whether it's to retire, to bring their medium and large size companies to do whatever, then that's part of a large part of what's driven this state over the last 3 or 4 decades. Well, guess what? If those companies can't afford to come here because they don't pay a wage that allows you to buy a starter home or a second home or whatever it is, then quite frankly, if Nevada becomes flyover country for responsible development folks, that's a bad thing, because that makes it more and more dependent just on what goes on the Strip and in other gaming venues, and all your eggs in one basket is not good.
Well, you hit perfectly onto our follow-up question, which is about the federal minimum wage. What would you consider a fair federal minimum wage in today's economic climate?
Well, I'm a little iffy on the whole thing of here's what you're going to pay people for a minimum, because quite frankly, you can set the minimum wage. It's like, you want it $20? You want it $25? You want it $30? Go ahead and make that the rule. Now turn around and go out and say, okay, I want to go out to dinner. Well, if those folks in the restaurant say, guess what? A cheeseburger and fries and a Coke in a small cup is now going to cost you $50. And if those people are suffering with, by the time I pay rent, so it's a big balancing act. So first of all, let me tell you this. The market setting that in terms of where people's comfort level is in terms of what I'm making versus what I'm paying after I'm not working is something that I don't think lends itself to legislation. Now, I have been persuaded in the past by going, hey, this is the last time. Here's what's happened with CPI. And so I find that stuff, and quite frankly, if everything's going up too, it's like, yeah, that's fine. But I think that's why, and by the way, Nevada did a minimum wage law a couple of sessions ago,
Just about to ask you about
which quite frankly, I thought was a fairly responsible way of taking all those things into consideration, which is why I voted against the federal law to say it would in effect repeal what the Nevada legislature did.
So we're phasing towards 12 an hour, and you're fine with that?
Yeah, because it's phased and it's got a little bit of input from those people who have to charge that because they know what people are willing to pay. And so, I mean, hold the presses, but it's like I much prefer that approach than the federal government going, here's the number, and by the way, one size fits all.
Well, and 725 has been hitting the one fits all for a couple of decades now. So do you think that should be bumped a little?
Well, I'm okay with it being bumped, but of course, the devil's in the details. It's like, okay, so we're going to go north of that. We're not going to lower it. Where are we going to go to and why? And so that's the discussion I'd like to see, which is one of the reasons I kind of like what the Nevada legislature did, because they had that discussion. And so everybody kind of knew what was going on. And lo and behold, when you got to the end of that, there was kind of consensus on that. And so it's like, there's nothing wrong with consensus if you go about it in a transparent, open way and you reach a solution.
Okay, so we're going to pivot to a different topic just real quick. You alluded to it a little bit earlier, but you didn't use the words climate change, just talked about energy independence.
Yeah.
You seem to be a supporter, from what you've said, of a responsible advance towards clean and green, as we call it, energy. But at this point in your mind, number one, how serious of a problem is climate change for Nevada and the United States? And then number two, if the Republicans manage to do well this election cycle, what do you think is possible in that realm with a Republican-led Congress?
Well, a lot of people will talk about the science, and so you say, well, the science, and that's almost become a throwaway term, because you got your science, my science. So you have to try to get to something like, hey, what's really happening here, okay? And what is responsible for it? Some of it's evolutionary. Doesn't mean you can ignore it if it's evolutionary. So it's like, whether it's evolutionary or whether it's because of coal in China or our past practices or what's going on in Europe, it's like all wonderful stuff. Where are we? Where do we think we're headed? And what can we do to minimize, slow that down, make it go away?
So where do you think we are, and what do you think we should do?
Here's where I think we are as a country. As a country, nobody's led more than we have in terms of trying to slow down carbon emissions. And some people say, well, it's not fast enough. It's like, well, it's faster than anybody else. Do we slow down? Heck no. Do we say we've crossed the finish line? Absolutely not. But nonetheless, you have to take that into account to go, okay, what can we do here? And oh, by the way, let's recognize as this country, if we're going to be leaders, what are they doing around the world? Because airsheds are not something that give a rip about national borders, as we know in Nevada, not even state borders. When you look at your air and see what's coming from Southern California, I look at my air up in the northern part of the state and see what's coming from the Bay Area, and you're going, it's not like it's like, okay, you're leaving this county and that county, put your blue outfit on instead of your green outfit. So having said all that, I have a saying that says everything that gets uber politicized gets destroyed in terms of trying to find the right policy. And this is one of those that, quite frankly, I think is very close to that, to where you're like, nobody wants dirty air, nobody wants dirty water, nobody wants polluted soil. And so what are the causes that we can agree on, and what are the solutions that we can do instead of, I want to go to war with oil companies, I want to shut down pipelines, I want to do all this stuff which sounds great for an agenda and may play great at a rally, but it's like, what have we really done for our airshed?
Do you have is there anything in the works that's on your radar that you've decided that you might support as a priority that has to do with this subject area?
Well, you know, we've supported some stuff in the last few sessions that have said this. Let's find out what we need to do to get to continue to lower the carbon footprint from fossil fuels. And this was in a couple of different bills. And to say this, when we find out what that is, if we need to raise some money for R&D, for research and development to get us farther down that road, then let's talk about what we need to do and how much that costs. Because I don't think, you can say they go away, and even this administration can make them go away, but the byproducts of that, I think we're finding out right now, are pretty steep, which quite frankly are hurting a lot of people. Once we find out what that is and say, what can we do and what's it going to cost, then if federal money needs to go to help that, then great. Let's talk about that and do some of that so we can continue to march responsibly down that road. What I said no to, though, was a proposal by some folks that said, we're going to put a carbon tax on everything that's carbon, and then with the money we collect from that, we're going to redistribute it with nothing to do with R&D. And it's like, if you really hate carbon, rather than redistributing it on a low income based thing, wouldn't you want to do R&D to get less? If it's really about carbon, then let's get less carbon and not use it for a way to redistribute wealth. So that's been the challenge so far.
What are you driving these days? Have you gone electric yet?
No.
Have you thought about it?
You know, I have some electric tools. Got to start somewhere.
Not quite the same.
Small steps. Well, ask California. They just outlawed all sorts of outdoor electric stuff. Chainsaws, you name it. Which, by the way, when we talk about air quality, when all that smoke comes rolling across that state line, it's like, I'd like to think that, since when you look at what's in that and how much it is, I'd like to think that making that go away as soon as possible is more important in the short term than, oh, by the way, you need a battery truck to follow your chainsaw around for the forest fire.
We're going to turn back to the Affordable Care Act now.
Okay.
There have been rumblings that if Republicans take control of Congress, that there will be another effort to repeal or overturn it. Do you agree that it should be overturned, or parts of it?
I think there are parts of it. I think the Affordable Care Act has become a talking point for both sides. One side says, oh, they want to get rid of it all and you're all going to die and you're not going to have any health care. And the other side says they want to keep it all and it's not tenable and you don't get to keep your dock and all that other sort of stuff. And I don't mean to brush over that lightly, but when it was up, I think it was in the first half of the Trump term, there was a bill that got out of the House, not by a lot of votes, but there was a bill that got out of the House that, quite frankly, we had gone through extensively and said, what's this going to do to federally qualified health centers in Nevada? What's this going to do to private insurers? Because we had a time when there was only 2 or 3 and maybe 1 or 2. So the choice really wasn't there. So there were a lot of moving parts, but we had gotten comfortable with the way that those would work. So do I want to make some changes if given the opportunity? Absolutely. Practically speaking, if you're not on some pick your favorite outfit TV show at night with the commentary going on, there are some things in the Affordable Care Act that were good. So when you say we want to appeal it all, or we want to repeal it all, it's like, we don't need to repeal it all. And by the way, if you think that's a good idea, see how good the rollout went where everybody had to now get on it? That was an absolute sites crashing, whatever nightmare. And quite frankly, it's a neat thing if you can learn from mistakes in the past. We don't always do that on either side, but it's like, I don't think you really want to do that. There are some areas that we can improve and we should improve them.
Which are?
Well, let me give you a success example. The federally qualified health centers in Nevada, in the last 10 or 15 years have gone from being a small piece of the access pie to a big piece. They are funded in large part by money from the federal government. And you know what? You got a bunch of them in Las Vegas. In my district, one of 4, there's like 14 or 15 right now. They're in Elko, they're in Lovelock, they're in Reno, multiple in Reno, Carson, you name it. And guess what? They're providing great care at a great price in conjunction with Medicaid. So it's like, hey, that's a success story. So when you say, what do we do to help that? It's like there is a tool, if you will, that's working. May not work for everybody, but it's working for a heck of a lot of people. And so they ought to, if you want to have the federal government in terms of doing something realistic about access to health care, that's a good one to go with.
What's not working?
Well, quite frankly, when you sit there and you go, so the cost to get in, you got a lot of doctors leaving the business right now. They're going to work for the hospitals or they're getting out. That affects access. So when you sit there and you say, hey, I need a dermatology appointment, depending on where you're at, it's like, well, guess what? We're not taking new patients, or we've got you scheduled in 4 months. Well, if you got something growing on your arm, it's like, well, I don't know how that's going to be in 4 months. And so that's not working real well. If it's well baby care, gynecology, you name it, it's not like, yeah, we can get you in next week or the week after. So when you talk about the cost to those providers, nursing shortages, doctor shortages, tech shortages, all that stuff, it's time to take a new look at how this has worked, because it's a vicious circle where, well, here's what Medicare will pay. And so the insurance companies go, well, we're not going to pay more than Medicare. Well, Medicare isn't out there. They're just going, I'm trying to balance the books. And so this is all we're going to give you. I mean, I can't tell you how many times a year I meet with different specialties to say, they're taking 2% of my bottom line here. And there's not a reason why. They're just taking it because they're trying to balance the books a little bit better. That isn't going to work forever.
Do you see any sort of solution to that tangled mess?
Yeah, quite frankly, I think you need to start talking about, listen, what are the realistic costs? Because you know who's leading the pack on all that? It's Medicare. That's a federal agency. And so you have to sit there and say, what are we paying for this and what are we doing for that? You got to go talk to those people and say, how can I keep you in business, but I don't want to basically break the bank on? There's no discussion right now. It's, hey, you got a 2% cut starting next fiscal year. Oh, I enjoyed that conversation. So, and you know, every administration fights it, but nobody said, okay, it's not pretty. We need to start sitting down with this, though. It's almost one of those things, kind of like Social Security. You know, it's going to go broke in 10 years. It's going to go broke in 15. It's already should have gone broke. Those sorts of things. So you sit there and you go, if you don't sit down and start focusing on the issue and the problem instead of the agenda or the talking point, then it's going to continue to metastasize, and we're going to continue to see the challenges, even in Nevada's largest metropolitan area, where you've got shortages of folks, where it's like, hey, you want to come to Las Vegas and practice? And it's like, well, we've got shortages. What the heck's going on here?
All right, let's talk immigration.
Okay.
Yeah, in February, you and your colleagues sent a letter to the Department of Homeland Security asking for records on how many undocumented immigrants had been released into the U.S. Mm-hmm. Have you heard anything about that?
Well, let's just say it's a good thing I wasn't holding my breath. No, I have not.
And you also called the Biden administration disastrous in handling immigration. Do you believe that Biden's immigration policies have actually affected your district adversely? And if so, how?
Well, let's go back to the beginning. And the beginning is this. I don't have the Constitution memorized, but there is a line in it that says the Congress will establish a system of naturalization. That means, to my way of thinking, it's Congress's job. Now, there's a lot of people that were critical of the Obama administration. They started Dreamers. They did a bunch of stuff through executive order. Now, I may not have agreed with all of those executive orders or any of them, but there's part of me that doesn't blame him, because it's like Congress didn't send him any new rules. And by the way, the last time that was updated was when Ronald Reagan was the president. So it's not like it's like, hey, we need to change that, even though it's just been changed a minute or two ago. It's like things in the country have changed since the 80s. So we need to update it. Congress is in vapor lock. Remember that everything that gets uber politicized gets destroyed as far as fixing it? So here we are. And so the Obama administration, and by the way, they said some things like, hey, Congress needs to send me something. Never did, never did. So they started doing executive orders. And there's
And
part
by
of me.
they, you mean the presidents kind of one after another.
Well, let me finish because that's right. Way to prompt me along. So anyhow, they do executive orders because there's a vacuum. The next administration comes in. Donald Trump did executive orders. Why? Because there's a vacuum. Donald Trump said, Congress, do your job, send me something or whatever. When they don't, he does his. And so now here we are with the Biden administration, nothing from Congress. And by the way, this is a bipartisan thing. I mean, when Nancy Pelosi's in charge, when Mitch McConnell's in charge, when John Boehner's in charge, it's like same result, zero. So you sit there and you go, you wonder why things are a mess right now is because as long as we don't establish what an updated set of rules should be, then it's like, well, you're going to get whatever the executive order whims are of that particular administration. And we've seen it 3 times now, and it isn't going to change until both sides' leadership in Congress have some guts and go, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do about dreamers. Here's what we're going to do about people who are here without an interview. Here's what we're going to establish in terms of the border and how we go forward from there. And right now, the reason it's a free-for-all is because Congress is more interested in politics than they are in solutions.
All right, so I've got some specifics, but you did not answer Janelle's question, which was,
What was it?
how have Biden's policies, for better or worse, affected, on immigration specifically,
here.
affected your district?
Yeah. Well,
What have you seen that to you is problematic?
I mean, let's put it this way. The number of undocumented folks that are in Nevada and the West has continued to rise. It has continued to present challenges for local and state officials to deal with services for people. And they're not all criminal justice, but there's criminal justice, there's public assistance, there's COVID issues. So it's like, how have they affected? Basically, with an open border for the last 14 months, all of those problems have been exacerbated, whether it's rural Nevada or metropolitan Nevada.
You kind of touched on it actually during your debate with Tarkanian. You said that the current border issues is, to blame in leadership on both sides.
Yeah.
And that you support specifically the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which, would be a legalization program for undocumented farm workers. And you touched on it a little bit, but what do you think should be done about those DACA recipients and other undocumented residents?
Well, we can talk about DACA a little bit. We can talk about the farm ones. I'll try to be crisp on both of them. Both of those instances, there are ways to put a framework up and say, for instance, I may not have agreed with when Barack Obama started the DACA program, but he did it. And so, kind of like we said on other stuff, it was the law until it's not the law. So those people who said, these are the rules, came in, signed up and said, here I am, I want to be in this program. It's like, you now have to deal with those. There are people there who are serving in the armed forces, quite frankly. And listen, I'm not, but it's like, if you signed up and you were a responsible citizen, you weren't a gangbanger, you don't have a criminal record, you weren't on public assistance, you did whatever your thing is. I mean, there's a lot of them that are working for the federal government. There's people working for this. So it's like, here's the deal, DACA folks. Here's your framework. You've got to basically come in and say, okay, and this is immigration right now, even if nobody changed anything. You got to go through a background check. We got to make sure that you haven't done anything that's, whatever. There should be, you can speed it up a little bit if you served in the military, other things like that. Have that discussion and then go, all right, if you get through that process, and there'll be some devil in the details. Is it 5 years? Is it 7 years? How does that work? But once you're at the end of that, you get a green card. And once you get the green card, if you want to go apply for citizenship, you're not going in front of anybody who's gone under the existing rules, stuff like that, so you're not cutting or anything, but there is a way. Now, some people go, oh my God, that's a path to citizenship. Well, that's a cliche. It's like, even Donald Trump said, I'm not opposed to immigration, but it's got to be merit-based, you've got to earn, blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's earning it. Go straight to the farm workers thing. That was a 5 to 9 year stint where you've got to work. You got to go through the background stuff. You got to pay if you were on public assistance, that sort of stuff, but you earn your ability to have a green card, and then if you want to go apply for citizenship after that, fine. That's merit-based earning your citizenship with those folks. And quite frankly, when your choice to that is there are no rules and every administration gets to ignore it or let it metastasize further, it's like, yeah, I'm going to vote for that. That's not amnesty. That's not open borders. That may help some challenger with a talking point. But quite frankly, if you're really about solving a problem, instead of just being able to high-five somebody in a bar because it's like, yeah, then it's like that's problem solving as opposed to what we got going on at the border now.
And would you support, in lieu of a path to citizenship, which, as you've mentioned, is politically fraught, would you support a path to permanent residency if citizenship was not an option under certain circumstances? Again, merit-based, there's a path for it. You've checked all your boxes. How do you feel about permanent residency as a partial solution to this problem?
Well, I'm not opposed to partial solutions at all because one size doesn't fit all in the immigration category. But when you get a bill from the other side that says, "Hey, we're going to do DACA, and you're all good to go," whatever, it's like, wait a minute. Some of those people have been convicted of domestic violence. Illegal gun stuff. It's like, I'm not voting for that. Or it's like, so when you say, would you support partial solutions? For me, and the reason that I was one of the people that voted for the Farm Bill, which by the way was supported by the U.S. Chamber, the Farm Bureau, and the cattlemen. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm just out here sailing along by my own, trying to solve a problem. But having said that, as long as they're merit-based, and you can point to people and go, well, this is, no, nobody's getting amnesty for anything. You've still got to go through a process that is merit-based and puts you in a position where you can say, just like the people who came before you, I earned this. I went through this. I waited for the time I was supposed to. I was not a public drain. I was not a public criminal. I was not any of that stuff. And so it's like, okay, then that's fine. So I would take a clear look at, I don't like to say what I'd support without seeing the bill, but for general concepts, it's like, is it merit-based? Is there background checks in it? Is there an amount of time? So it's not like, hey, you're just checking the box and there you go right on in and have a nice time. There's an ability to look at that. And then quite frankly, and here's probably the most shocking thing I'm going to say is, if it turns out after all that, it turns out you're deserving, then you're deserving.
I'm going to ask one more question on this topic that just came to me, actually. So the border. We've been talking about the border ever since I've been on the planet.
Yeah.
Trump's wall got sort of built, but not all the way built. Now we've got a new administration.
They don't like the wall.
Just real quick, in a couple sentences, what's the one thing that needs to happen on the border in your mind that is not happening right now?
The one thing.
The most important thing.
Okay, I just froze up.
Or you can name two things.
Okay. I'll do the best I can. I think the wall was a good idea. It's not the solution. It's not going to stop everything, but you know what? It was a piece of the puzzle, and it helped. There's still $1.8 billion that is authorized, not appropriated, and we saved that in the omnibus. You know that I was an evil guy for voting for in some geniuses' opinions, but it's like it's still there.
Which genius are you referring to, sir?
Well, there's a lot of geniuses in the country. So anyhow, I think that's a piece of the puzzle. I think for the rules that are there now in terms of, and the rules is kind of an amorphous thing these days, but still it's one of those things where the situation we have now, which is, hey, we don't want to create any photo opportunities with a bunch of people under a bridge, so we're moving them out of the area of that as soon as we can to other areas in smaller numbers. It's like, that's an absolute disaster, undermines confidence of everybody in the country, regardless of what your politics are. You know, if you're doing it in the middle of the night, unless it's, you know, replacing streetlight bulbs, it's usually not, it's like something you don't want to do where people can see easier. It's commonsensical.
Did it bother you during the Trump administration when hundreds of children were being separated from families and parents and going for weeks and months? without.
Here's what bothered me. I don't know whether that was the right policy or not. Doesn't sound like it, but it had been going on long before Trump was there, completely unreported. And because it was Donald Trump now, it was like, oh my God, would you look at this? And you're like, well, if that was something that was started under him, then it's like, fair enough. But it was one of those things where, well, it was okay. It was business as usual.
Do you think it's bad policy for us to do that, regardless of who's president?
Well, I think what you go back to is it's bad policy to allow things to get to the point where you've got all these people in your country now that are basically unvetted, unscreened, unwhatevered. And so you're trying to just, it's like saying, well, I've got a 24-gallon tank of gas, but guess what? Where I'm driving to is going to require 34 gallons. And so it's like you either need to drive to a different place, quit letting all these people come across, where you've just got to react based on no notice, or you've got to have facilities going, we got to have facilities, we don't know how many it's going to be.
Fair enough, but are you saying that you support, I'm really trying to just drill down on this topic in general, regardless of who's responsible for it or how long it's been going on, of small children being separated from their families for long periods of time. As things stand now, that's happening.
I got you.
Do you oppose that, or are you fine with it?
But I am uncomfortable with the context of your question in that it's like, listen, that is part of the overall problem of, are we just open for business and come one, come all? Because that includes small children. Or
no one's hang on a second. I'm not. I'm asking a very small question in a big pond. I understand that. So,
but you can't separate kids from their parents. And so when you say, well, this is the issue, and you're like, well, tell me, then let me deal with it globally. It's not just kids, it's who are they coming with? And granted, some of them are not even coming with their parents. They're being sent across. But that takes away the separation thing. Somebody else made that decision on the other side of the border.
Understood, but you have children, correct?
They're grown. Yes.
They were once small, and if you had sent a small child with a cousin to cross a border.
Wouldn't have done that, but anyhow, guess I'm a lucky guy.
All right, well, we can move on. So we're going to switch to January 6th.
Okay.
You voted against the creation of the January 6th Commission.
Yep.
You also called the insurrection a tragedy.
Yep.
Your reasoning for voting against the formation of the commission, I think, was because it was hyper politicized, something you referred to a number of times in this interview. So now it's a year later. How do you feel about your vote against the commission? And what, if anything, do you think needs to happen for President Trump specifically in terms of accountability?
Well, how do I feel about my vote? I feel even better now. And that's because at the time I said we've got, and I don't remember whether it was 5 or 6 committees on the House who have jurisdiction over things like that, who have full ability to like, hey, get in here, we want to talk about the 6th, whether it's the ledge ops, whether it's the money committees, there was at least 2 of them, admin and ledge ops, whether it was committees of issue jurisdiction like judiciary or House admin or things like that. And so it's like there was no shortage of people with jurisdiction over what the heck happened, why did it happen, who said what to who, when, all that other sort of stuff. But no, we're going to have a special select committee. And by the way, if it was like, no, we're going to have a special select committee and that was the last, but also we're not going to let you, Kevin McCarthy, put the people you want on the committee. It's going to be almost like, no offense to the appraisers, it's going to be a made-to-order membership on that committee. And you're going, wow, that sounds pretty objective and non-political. And then you go forward with that outfit. And I mean, the latest example is, so anybody who signed things saying, hey, here's who we picked for president, and Nevada's Republican electors did that, you get subpoenaed to go back and sit in front of them. And you're going, really? And so you sit there and look at it. And so when I heard that, I said, give me the document that Michael McDonald, Jim DeGraff, and Reed, those folks all signed. I look at the document and it says, we're the Republican electors. That was a true statement. And we picked Donald Trump. Now that's, it was a one-pager, and you can look at it, but I'm looking at this going, they didn't sign it under penalty of perjury or whatever, although it's like they didn't lie. They're the Republican electors, and they picked Donald Trump. When they went through the process of counting votes, it's like, well, our count says Joe Biden won Nevada, so we want to know what the Democratic electors did. And those are the ones whose votes were counted in the canvass of the Electoral College. But nonetheless, this committee, let's get these guys back there so we can see whatever. And you're like, wow, does this sound political? And you may say, no, it doesn't sound political to me, Alex. Well, it looks pretty political to me. I mean,
So you don't think,
I don't think a document that says we are the Republican electors, which Steve Sisolak and Barbara Sagaski signed the document saying these are the Republican electors, and we picked Trump. Quite frankly, nobody cares under our process when you read the Nevada revised statutes. They don't care what the Republican or independent electors sign on anything because the count through the Secretary of State's office from the state clerk says they didn't win. So it's a nice little trivia thing. It has no force and effect under existing Nevada revised statutes, but yet they get called back.
so back to Trump. In your mind, does he have any responsibility, whether it's small, medium, or large, in what happened on January 6th?
In view of what's come up from people like the FBI and stuff, where they're going days before.
I'm not asking about all that.
I got to look at that.
I'm sure you have looked at it, so what do you think?
I don't think you can blame him for what happened on the 6th when people were buying ropes and stuff before the rally. By the way, it was all about the rally. Before the rally even happened, it's like, oh, well, the intelligence agency said, hey, we're monitoring stuff on the internet, blah, blah, blah. We're watching people. There's chitter and chatter amongst the Proud Boys. So no, let me just shorten it up. If you look at what's out there, no.
Trump was talking about, you don't think he was talking about election fraud before the election even happened.
Well, yeah, but so were the Democrats.
But they weren't claiming that the election was about to be stolen, and they didn't claim on the day of the election that the election was presently being stolen, and they didn't talk for weeks on it.
They did in 2016, and nobody paid attention.
And that's good enough for you?
Well,
it's a tit for tat? So no one's responsible for anything?
I'm glad. Well, quite frankly, I mean, what do you think about the First Amendment? Can people say stuff?
Well, people can certainly say stuff, and Donald Trump, but I'm not asking you whether.
Incite a riot. Listen, this is in the context of the second impeachment. And so that second impeachment vote was taken 7 days after the 6th. No procedure, no rules, no nothing. But yet we're supposed to respect the rules, and we do. And by the way, there's a lot of us that are getting criticized for it.
Well, you're throwing a bunch of stuff in the kitchen sink here.
Well, it's all relevant to the 6th.
So you don't think Trump has any responsibility for what happened on January 6th?
I don't think so after what we've got from the investigations that weren't run by the January 6th committee.
Okay. And if he runs again, as I think he's expected to, you'll support him?
Well, we'll see what he decides.
If he does?
Well, then, let me put it this way. That's a crystal ball that's almost 3 years out. So quite frankly, it's like, listen, I'll see what he does and why he does it, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
I'm stating the obvious here, but the political field is quite polarized.
Yeah, even within itself.
Bipartisanship is important, though.
Yeah.
You already referenced some of the flack you got for supporting the omnibus bill. What's your response to fellow Republicans who say you're not conservative enough?
Well, I mean, if an A rating from the National Rifle Association is conservative enough, then I am. If voting for things in an omnibus bill, which quite frankly put the Hyde Amendment back in, which is the reason why you keep your right to life ratings that you do, if being endorsed by leading Republicans in the Congress and in the state is like, what, did I fool everybody for the last 10 years? Or is it just one of these things where somebody's got some talking points? It's like, oh, the border's open. Really? The border's open, quite frankly, because there's executive orders that made it open. The outfit that does Trump vote ratings, I'm a 95. That's more than Jim Jordan. That's more than the head of the Republican Study Committee or whatever. But those are all just facts. They may not make for very good stuff when you're out there, talking smack about somebody and there's no fact checking. So it's kind of like the irony of, Twitter and Facebook or things that are like, well, or fake news and all that other sort of stuff where you're just sitting there going, well, quite frankly, when you hear it on those things, even ones that kicked Donald Trump off and have shut down other Republicans, and you go, well, hell, it was on Twitter. It must be true. So, I mean, quite frankly, that's the challenge for me. What do you say to those people? It's like, well, if you're fact-based, I think you'll like what the facts say. But if it's all about, whatever the latest talking points are and how much you can ignore the facts, it's like we'll see what most of the voters think in the middle of June.
All right, so a couple months ago, maybe it was more than a couple, you decided not to run for governor.
Yep.
Have you had any second thoughts about that?
Fair question, but here's what, and I put out a release that was about this long. So only in this business can you have a bunch of people saying, hey, we really wish you'd run for governor, and then 6 months later you're a nasty Republican and you stink and you should just go away. But that's the business, and it's been that way before and it will be that way after. Here's what the bottom line was for me is, when you got up to about 8 or 9 people, which was not the height of the number of people, it became obvious to me, it's like if you're going to run for governor, you got to quit your job for the last half of your term. And so it's not very political, but it's one of those things where if you quit your job, then you got to have a special election and you got to throw all this stuff open, and then whoever wins it has to turn around and run in 2022 again. That's a messy way to leave. And so I felt very old school, I guess, which doesn't get you any points politically these days, but it's like, I asked for this job. I said it was important. I may not love the culture in DC, but the work is important. And I don't think it's a good way to leave by going, hey, I got this new toy that I think is pretty neat. And so I'm leaving halfway through because I'm going to go over here. And by the way, would you support me for that? So, I don't have any. The question was, do you have any regrets?
Yeah.
It's like,
You don't.
none at all.
So does what you just said, I'm curious, does that trickle down to any of the current candidates? For example, current Sheriff Joe Lombardo is running for governor. He has not quit his job to do that. It looks to me like he's trying to run for governor and do his job at the same time. Do you think that's a wrong call on his part? Well,
I don't know what it's like to be the sheriff, but I'll just tell you this. My analysis of what my responsibility was to fulfilling the term that I had asked for and I was given, my analysis of trying to do 2 things at once did not come out good for me, which is why I didn't say, okay, I'm in, and oh, by the way, I resign, and oh, by the way, the governor's got to set a date for a special election, and oh, by the way, however that goes, you got to turn around again and a year later run in a regular election. So that was a pretty messy way. I don't know what the succession stuff is for Clark County. I obviously know what the term is. But I think, and like I said, it's in no political Bible. Absolutely, you can't. It goes on all the time. As a general proposition, I think it keeps faith with your voters if you fulfill the obligation that you asked them to give you.
So you've been watching the race for a couple months now, like the rest of us. Have you picked a favorite yet?
Yeah.
Who do you think? I mean, do you have an opinion on who, in light of the political climate in Nevada, knowing Sisolak and what he's done and how he's done, is there someone in your mind that stands out as maybe the best situated Republican to take him on?
My analysis is this, and it kind of goes back into when I was going through it. I think you're going to have a lot of fracturing of Republican votes in Clark County. I think when you look at the history, now, we never had mail-in ballots before in a Republican primary, so that's a big asterisk out there. But when you look at it, the last 3 or 4 Republican primaries, 46% of the vote was in the other 16 counties, and 54-ish was in Clark County. And so you say, what does that mean? That means if somebody can unify the North, then they got a pretty good shot. I think the vote in Clark County in a Republican primary will be fractured. That's no disrespect to anybody, or whatever. It's like, well, obviously the hometown guy should have an advantage, and we'll see how much that relates to. But then the challenge, you can put that shoe on the other foot and say, well, so who's going to unify the other 16 counties? And the last piece of that is, and then I'll shut up, and you can follow up, since it's your show, is there's still 7 weeks to go. Now, not really 7 weeks because ballots are getting mailed out and whatever. So let's say 4 or 5 weeks. Let's say 4 weeks. And so immediacy is primacy in this business. And so who's launching and who's doing what in the next 4 weeks? Because I think it's wide open. So if your question is, what do you think? I go, I think, people keep waiting for somebody to kind of emerge and start building the lead. I haven't seen that happen.
Has anyone asked you for your endorsement among that group?
Yeah, but quite frankly, I mean, let's be real selfish and political for a minute. Even if I pick the right person, especially in this primary, I'm going to upset a majority of the voters. And so it's like, with all due respect, whoever asks, what about you? It's like, quite frankly, I've been around long enough to go, hey, I'm not getting into that. There's no upside for me in that. And oh, by the way, I've never basically ran on, hey, this person, you know, supported me or whatever. Although that may change a little bit this time since my Republican credentials, some people think are lacking. It's like, well, then I wonder why they're all endorsing you. But having said that, yeah, I've been asked, and I've been right up front immediately saying, hey, I'm not getting involved.
So you're not going to endorse?
No.
Flat out, regardless of what happens?
Correctamundo.
Okay. We will end on that note. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
you so much.
And I didn't break anything while I was here.
You did not. Viewers, thanks so much for joining us for this very interesting interview with Congressman Mark Amodei, who is running for re-election. We will have more such interviews in the weeks to come, so we hope you will stay tuned.